Hi, everybody. It's Ayla, Wife with a Purpose here. Thank you for joining us this evening. I hope you guys are headed into a wonderful weekend. I am here tonight with Luis Miguel, and I've had him on before, and he is a wonderful guest. We're going to be covering a wide variety of topics. I think it's going to be super interesting. I'm going to go ahead and switch my screen over right now so I can make sure that I see the comment section. Go ahead and tag Ayla Stewart, wife with a Purpose, in the comments if you want me to see your comments. I'm going to try to keep a really good eye on the comment section tonight. Sometimes I get caught up and I can't, or it's just really difficult to scroll through. You can also send a super chat if you want to make sure I see it. I almost always will see those because they pop up in a special section. Yeah, without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce my guest tonight. Luis, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm first and foremost a writer, currently writing at a political consulting firm, developing advertising for politicians, but don't worry, only for the good ones. Previous to that, I was in journalism, and again, you don't have to worry about having been a member of the opposition media. I was writing for conservative websites, maybe some of the ones that you know, like Bizpack Review, Mad World News. Right now, I still do some of my own writing on the side. Actually, I have luisantoniomiguel.com, which is where you can find my blog posts. I just did one yesterday, actually, on the communist ties of Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. A couple days before that, I also rolled one out. It was looking into, actually was explaining the case for President Trump declaring a national emergency in order to build a wall. So if you have some spare time, do some reading, you can head on over there. I'm also on Twitter at Luis Miguel US, and Facebook as well, Luis Miguel for America, if you're on Facebook.
Excellent, thanks. So yeah, I highly recommend his work if you guys are looking for someone to read who is clear, concise, and coming from a really well-informed perspective, and also a Christian perspective, which I think is really, well, it doesn't, not that everything Luis writes about is Christian, but that is really where a lot of the center of his knowledge is, and so it really adds depth, I think, to what he's doing. So we wanted to talk tonight, I think, a little bit about Richard Spencer's recent remarks, as well as kind of the idea of the fake right and international conspiracies. And so I think what we'll go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and play a clip. I'm going to set my set this on screen share here for a second. And I'm going to go ahead and play a clip for you all. Hopefully this works. I'm not a very boomer tech. And so hopefully you guys can hear it. But this was Richard Spencer. Oh, I think it's been about a week now ago was doing, I think it was his Richard Spencer show. And he made some comments about the Tower of Babel, which most Christians are familiar with. Very briefly, for anyone who isn't familiar, it's the Bible story where a lot of different peoples had come together and tried to basically create kind of their own one world order, where they were going to build this huge tower together, and they were going to reach the heights of God, or reach up to heaven through this massive consolidation without earning, their entrance into heaven. They were going to reach up to heaven or God, or become, and there's an implication there, better and bigger than God through their united efforts to build this huge tower. And that God, being displeased with this, confounded their languages and, made it so that different people were speaking different dialects and different tongues and couldn't understand each other. And therefore they could not come together to create this like massive global network to build up to the heights of heaven, or to be better, or think they were better than God. And so that story is one that is often cited by Christian nationalists as to why Christianity is a nationalist religion. It teaches us that God specifically does not want the entire world coming together to create some kind of global dominant force that is, that they believe rivals God himself, or at least reaches the same heights. And so Richard Spencer had an interesting take on this. I'll go ahead and play it now. And please, in the chat, if for some reason you can't hear it, let me know, and we can I can replay it or we'll summarize it. But here we go. Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop it there because that's kind of the meat of what he was saying. Let me see if I can figure out how to stop. There we go. Stop my screen share. Hop on over to the comments real quick. Oh, shoot. Somebody says they can't hear. Is it playing? Can't hear either. Darn it. I thought I was doing that correctly, and I did not do that correctly. Shoot. Okay. So, Luis, why don't you just go ahead and summarize then what Richard's response to this Tower of Babel stuff was about?
Okay. Well, first of all, and the good news is for everybody is that I have a transcript right here. And first of all, Spencer made the remark because he was responding to a caller, giving some of the background, who was criticizing what Spencer terms pan-nationalism, which according to him is a notion that every nation should be independent, sovereign, just mind its own business. And I'll talk in a minute about why he's incorrect in his understanding of that. But anyway, so Spencer goes on to say, I basically agree with his criticism of what you could say is pan-nationalism. First of all, he says it's good in theory, but then he says, as an actual ideology, I think it absolutely fails. This is simply not how the world works. Nations and states are born, they live, they flourish, they decay, and they die. And we can't just freeze the world as it is now and say, nothing ever changes from here on out. He goes on to say, as an actual philosophy, this pan-nationalism I've never had any interest in it. One thing we can learn from the modern world, there are hegemonic power blocks across the world. He goes on to say, there's going to be big kahunas out there who have more power than others, who are going to form the geopolitical order. That's just what it is. And he makes a case that what should be done, what he presumes that Western nations should do, is form those hegemonic power blocks and become those superpowers. I lost the rest of the transcript here, but the person who was speaking with him brings up the Tower of Babel, and that's when Spencer comes out and says that the Tower of Babel story as we know it should actually be inverted. He said he wants to turn on his head, and that we should actually build the Tower of Babel. That basically the biblical wisdom should be ignored, because biblical wisdom apparently is what's holding our nations back, and that we should do exactly the opposite in order to defy God and build this hegemonic power for the European nations.
Right. Yeah. So what really stuck out to me was two things. One, when the caller was describing the Tower of Babel, he phrased it as, the Jewish God confounded their languages. And this is something that a lot of people on the alternative right, or the right, or the far right, or the new right, or whatever you want to call it, will sometimes use against Christians, is, claiming, oh, well, it's a Jewish God that you worship. And there's a lot of rebuttals to that. But I mean, the most simple thing is, especially for Christians, it's not the Jewish God. And you can go and ask a rabbi, do you believe in the same God as Christians? And most will tell you no. And, if you ask Christians who your God is, for not all Christians, but for most Christians, that is the Trinity. It's Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And so Christ is God. And so the Christians worship Christ. And of course, Jews rejected Christ and don't believe in Christ. And so, and also for most Christian religions, in fact, I can't think of one off the top of my head who doesn't believe this, Christ is the Jehovah of the Old Testament as well. And so that would have been, it's the Christian God that would have been at the Tower of Babel. And so it's just factually untrue that it's a Jewish God. And that's kind of a trick that's played to be very divisive and very anti-Christian on the far right. And then the other thing that stuck out to me was the phrase that Spencer used, and he says, we need to turn this supposed biblical wisdom on its head. And of course, that's just basically coming out and doing exactly what we know the adversary, the devil, Satan, whatever you want to call him, that's what he does. He takes biblical truth and inverts the truth. And, I could give dozens of examples I have in the past on my show, but that's basically always how the devil works, because the devil usually comes as an angel of light. He doesn't come, people always mistake, like, oh, the devil's going to come to me as this like horned creature that wants me to write my name in his book with blood. He's going to come as something evil. He's going to come and tell me to commit murder or do something bad. And so most people mistakenly think, oh, well, I'll just reject it. When I see evil, I'll just reject it. But no, the Bible tells us the devil will come in the angel of light, because he'll take the truth and he'll flip it around and try to call, good evil and evil good. And therefore people will follow after the devil, thinking they're doing the right thing a lot of the time. And that's how he tricks us. And so for Spencer to come out and so blatantly say, supposed biblical wisdom, and that we needed to flip it on its head, that we needed to invert it, was really striking to me. Although, of course, not surprising given the turn that Spencer has taken this past year. And that was one of the reasons I decided not to use the term alt-right anymore, even though I'd always been a Vox Day alt-right person, not a Spencer alt-right person. And I'd always tried to make that clear delineation when I was talking about the alt-right. But what made me completely leave the term behind was last Easter, when he had some very just completely hostile anti-Christian people writing for altright.com these like crazy articles, and you can like debate the facts of the articles, but the main essence of it was that it was very, very anti-Christian. And then it came out, of course, at the end of last year that he had left his wife and child, that he's now dating a feminist and an open Satanist. And so now we have him talking about making these Tower of Babel remarks. So unfortunate, but not surprising, I guess, I would say. What is your take on this, Luis?
Yeah. Well, I actually ended up finding the rest of that transcript.
Oh.
And, he comes out and he says, this is what we do. We build the Tower of Babel. We build Rome, and we centralize things and bring people together. And this can last a long time. Now, part of my response to Spencer, the first thing is that he doesn't even properly explain what pan-nationalism is. I was about to say he doesn't understand. I'm certain he understands, but he's most likely deliberately trying to mislead people. What he calls pan-nationalism is simply genuine nationalism. This concept that he mocks of nationalism, of every person, every nation. Nation, of course, we understand as being people of a common ancestry, who are blood related from the same ancestors, same language, same culture, religion, traditions, way of life. Each nation living independently and sovereignly. But he mocks that and calls it pan-nationalism, instead of calling for everybody to join together who's of the same race. Well, there he's conflating race and nation. And we've seen true pan-nationalist movements, and they always fail. The pan-Arab movements, pan-African movements, pan-Asian movements. Race is not nation. The European peoples may all be white, and he seems to believe or be suggesting that whiteness is a race. But the cultures of these nations in Europe are so diverse and so different from one another. That's part of the beauty of it, is how distinct they each are. And to think that all of them can join together and they're going to live happily ever after in this huge hegemonic bloc is just ridiculous. Just look at history. You take, for instance, a Croat and a Serbian. You look at them, you might say, oh, they're both white to the average person who's looking outside in. But the differences between them, culturally, ethnically, and otherwise, are so strong that that's why you had the Croatian War of Independence that resulted in them breaking away from Yugoslavia. Eventually, you even had the Montenegrins breaking away from the Slavs and forming their own two countries. So people want to live their own way. People who are of a certain nation, they want to live according to their own customs. And I believe that they have a right to do so. That's the essence of nationalism. But that's exactly what Spencer is arguing against here.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that there's obviously different levels that you can look at nationalism and at the interrelation between race and culture and nation, and there's definitely that far out view of pulling way back and saying, okay, there's white people, there's black people, there's Asiatic people, and seeing that there is some common similarities there, root languages, similar holidays, and things like that. So there is, there is a whiteness to Europeans in that they're going to have similar language, or a language root family. They're going to probably all have, Christmas, Easter, similar customs like that. But then there is once you zero in and you can get more and more narrow and look at the individual nations, and then even something as Germany, where you can look at Southern German culture versus Northern German culture. You can look at the individual towns, and even sometimes, the different sides of town within individual towns. And you can go very micro, or you can pull back and look very macro. And the point being that, if the whole world was imploding and, everything was topsy-turvy, maybe you could look at the macro and say, let's just save the, groups as we can in this kind of catch-all. But we don't have to do that. We're not at that point. And that would be like a last ditch, again, the world is imploding kind of solution. Right now, we're not at that point where, entire racial categories are going to die. Or die out. So what we need to do is not need to do, but what we can do still is focus on those nations that, again, were taught biblically that God created, that he set the boundaries of their inhabitants and the nations of the people, and look at like you were saying, the beauty and diversity within something like European culture and the individual countries within that, the individual nations, and even the individual provinces within those nations, and say, hey, these are valuable, these cultures are valuable, these people are valuable, these traditions are valuable. Why not, strengthen that instead of trying to get to some idea that all white Europeans are going to band together with some kind of monolithic state, which is, kind of what the UN was created for, right? Like that was kind of the idea behind, or the European Union, European Union. And we've seen that be rejected. England doesn't want their fate and their lives and their currency or anything else tied to Greece or to France, and vice versa. And it's really failed because it is too much. It's too close to this Tower of Babel yet. This is what Spencer seems to be advocating for.
Right. And interestingly enough, you bring up the Brexit, European Union. Spencer himself was an advocate of European Union. he took a stance against Brexit, if you recall.
Right, yeah.
I mean, in a 2016 article that ran on Reddit's Journal, he said he praised the European Union as a, quote, potential race empire. He also said he has no problem with immigration between European countries, saying that there was no problem with migration from members of the former Soviet bloc to Western Europe. And he even said, and I have a quote from him here, only a fool would view waves of white Christian Slavs as an existential threat to Britain. To the contrary, they are assimilable and arguably a real example of vibrancy and enrichment. Now, it's kind of funny. You could take this quote and replace, migration to America with Latin Americans, and it sounds like a Democrat speaking, like a liberal progressive advocating for open borders here in the U.S.
Oh yeah, 100%, definitely. Yeah, and I mean, go ahead.
Oh yeah, but the main thing is returning to what you said, the Tower of Babel. And the fact with Spencer is that he, in reality, is not of the right. I mean, you said yourself, he's dating a feminist who's a Satanist. Not only has he advocated for the European Union, he doesn't believe in important restraints that we believe on the right, like limited government, national sovereignty. He's very much of the left, and at the end of the day, he's not a nationalist. What he is, as many others have noted, is an imperialist. He's just as much an imperialist as the globalists advocating for world government through organizations like the United Nations and others, just as much an imperialist as the neoconservatives in the US, who are constantly pushing for endless wars that have nothing to do with our national interest.
Definitely. Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think that this has been something I remember actually when Spencer was, anti-Brexit and was praising the European Union. And I definitely, didn't agree with that. And I made a tweet back when I had my Twitter account that, I didn't think that Slavic immigration should overtake England any more than any other type of immigration. And definitely I can see that there's an argument to be made that, again, there's a similarity between European countries that you wouldn't get with someone from Africa or China or somewhere else. And that is more easily assimilatable. And I understand that argument, but it doesn't mean that both things can't be true. And again, I think that it gets down to people becoming really hardlined in their thinking and not being able to hold out the truth of the matter that, yeah, again, if there was some kind of global pandemic or some kind of end of the world thing, maybe, all of, what's left of Europe uniting together and getting along with focusing on the similarities, that might, be the best thing at a point like that. But certainly we're nowhere near that. And any kind of open borders amongst European nations is also going to threaten those individual cultures. The same as, China. I always make the comparison to Tibet. Chinese culture and Tibetan culture are very distinct and different. But then, of course, they're both Asian cultures. So they do share some similarities as well. But nobody on the left, even, well, they used to, they've kind of changed now, would advocate for the Chinese to overrun Tibet the way they have. And in fact, they used to be very against it. Free Tibet was a really big thing. It was a big movement, something that the left used to believe in. We used to understand that was a bad thing when a lot of Chinese were moving in and taking over the culture and breeding out the people and, forcing the religious leaders out and, denying people their religion and their culture and their heritage and all of these things, that this was a bad thing. And so it's very, again, I guess definitely it gets down to racial imperialism, I think, versus nationalism. And again, I can be sympathetic and understand where some people are coming from in this idea that they want to unite, but I don't think we're there. And I don't think that's necessary. And I don't think that I honestly don't think it ever will be. I don't ever think we're going to have some kind of global meltdown where, just all Europeans need to band together. I don't think it's actually going to be like that. I think preserving our national sovereignty is not only intellectually the best thing, but I think spiritually the best thing. I'm going to pause just really quick here for a second because we've got some super chats. John Smith, $2 says Google, and then he gives me a name, but I'm not sure how to pronounce this, so I'm gonna completely botch this. Nemes Quinn Malkion Golden Huck Magazine. I have no idea what that is. So, but that's what the super chat said. Mr. Minnesota 99 says, or just $2, no comment. Thank you very much. John Smith, $2, no comment. Thank you. And Truck My Ad says, $2, love the young trads preaching. Thank you so much, Truck My Ad. I always appreciate seeing you here in the comment section. And Chuck My Ad also just said, Mormons and Amish do it right. Circle the wagons and breed. I certainly agree with that. Definitely. Okay, so yeah, so Luis, give us some of your thoughts on Spencer's remarks, and also this fake, the fake right, the fake far right, the neocons. I mean, there's just like so much fakery, like everywhere you turn your head.
Oh, absolutely. And sadly, it's all part of the plan of the people who are deliberately trying to destroy our civilization. Touching Spencer and Tower of Babel for a minute, it all relates. But you mentioned just a moment ago in the spiritual aspect of this. And that's the key right there. Because at the end of the day, all of these things that you see as being political is having political ramifications for countries and states and nations. But the end goal truly is spiritual. If you go back to the Tower of Babel, and it explains very clearly in those verses in Genesis 11 why it was that it was so offensive to God that he did what he did. It wasn't that he didn't like them building a huge building. It wasn't that he didn't like these people dabbling in architecture. When they set out to build the Tower of Babel, the builder said that they wanted to get to heaven without God's obedience to God's law. They believed that through their own ingenuity, through their technology, they were making God irrelevant. Sounds really similar to what we're saying today, doesn't it? So they believed that they were making God irrelevant. And that's always been the object of Satanism or Luciferianism, whatever you want to call it, is that desire to be able to do whatever they want without restriction, without the restrictions of God's laws. Going all the way back to the Garden of Eden, when Satan said to Adam and Eve, you shall be as gods. If they disobeyed a particular fruit, they would be as God. That desire for man to become God, to take the place of God. It's the same reason why the left is so opposed to walls fundamentally. The left, and I guess going beyond the left, just the everything that's encompassed by Satanism, which the left is part of, but isn't all of it. But why they're so fundamentally opposed on a spiritual level to the notion of building walls, because it goes beyond simply national borders. We read in the scriptures that heaven has a wall and a gate. Only those who are obedient to the laws of God, who accept Jesus Christ as their Savior, can get in. The walls keep everybody else out. And that is what the servants of Satan absolutely hate, that those walls keep them out, that they're not allowed to get in is without giving up their sins, without giving up what they believe is their freedom. They want that freedom, which is really license, but they want what they perceive to be the freedom to do whatever they wish. So what Satan does is he deceives people. And all these things that we're seeing are really different sides of the same thing. Whether it's Richard Spencer's racial imperialism, whether it's the neocons. And once you start investigating it, looking closer into it, you realize that they actually have a lot of the same roots. Take the neocons, for example. They even have the gall to call themselves, to put the word conservative in there, neoconservatives. If you look at their history, well, a lot of you probably know this, but a lot of people outside don't, mainstream folks. But the neoconservatives are so called because they were the neoconservatives who arose around the 40s, 50s, had their beginnings, really came to prominence in the 70s. And the neocons were Trotskyists. They were communists, and they defected from their support for the Soviet Union because of differences they had with Stalin. There were some philosophical differences there. The Trotskyists were very much in favor of world revolution, and there was also the fact of the fight that occurred there between the two, the power struggle, that left a lot of bad feelings. So neocons were Trotskyists, but they hated Stalin. So they said, okay, well, we'll become Republicans, we'll become conservatives. But remember, Trotskyism was all about world revolution. So the neocons never gave up. They might have called themselves neocons, but they never gave up their desire for world revolution. And instead of creating professing to create a worldwide Soviet socialist empire, they simply said, well, we'll create our socialist empire. We'll make it with the United States as the basis instead of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think that you can see this just in the way that they behave. And I think that in the past couple of years, particularly with nationalism on the rise and Trump and all of this, and you can see it because the second anyone conservative or Republican dares to talk about nationalism or something like this and gets labeled a racist by the left, the neocons are the first to throw them under the bus. They're the first to say, "Oh, we have nothing to do with you. You're Nazi or whatever." And it's absolutely bizarre because they'll take, and it's usually the extreme left. It's certainly not the moderate left that are claiming that nationalists are Nazis or whatever. Mm-hmm. But the neocons will actually they will throw their own people under the bus for the opinions of the far left, not even the left, but the far left extremists, just their opinions, because they think that I don't know what, but we all know logically they'll never be liked by those people, but they're still making sacrifices to them and to that ideology, quite literally. Yeah.
I mean, they're one of them in reality.
Right.
They might not admit to it publicly, but that's who they are. I mean, Bill Kristol, who I'm sure everybody here hates. His father, Irving Kristol, is the father of neoconservatism. Irving Kristol was one of them. He was a Trotskyist, communist, and so they're all really in league, working for the same people. You have other brands of fake right. You have the Buckleyite faction of the right. Right in parentheses, because again, none of them are really right. Mm-hmm. And sadly, Buckley is dead, but Buckleyism continues to live on through different people at National Review, Jonah Goldberg and company. And going back to Irving Kristol, I don't have the exact quote with me here, unfortunately, but he stated back when he got started, he said that the goal that they had was to keep the right from moving too far to the right. They didn't want what they consider to be fringes taking over. They want to keep it in the moderate center. Or in other words, that's code for they want to move the American right to the left. Mm-hmm. And we can see that gradualism. How conservatives always seem to, American conservatives are always losing to the left, losing as gentlemen, and then instead of trying to take back ground that they've lost when they can, instead they canonize the left's gains as their own, and now they try to conserve those gains. They were really part of leftism.
Definitely.
Just think of some of the things we've seen socially in recent years, for example, with gay marriage. If they truly believed what they believe as far as the sacred nature of marriage as established by God between one man and one woman, then they would still be continuing to fight and make gains to bring that back to what it should be, where they can. Instead, they're out, these neocons or these fake right people, they're out there parroting leftist talking points, saying, oh, we believe in gay rights, we support the LGBTQ community. Well, hold on. If you believe that, why were you trying to fight against gay marriage just a few years ago? What do you actually believe? Well, we know. In reality, they've always been on the same page with the left all this time. Their posturing to true Christian principles and doctrines was never anything more than an act.
Yeah, definitely. I think you can see that now. And I think that it's one of those things, I think for me too, that it takes a little bit of life wisdom and experience to see, because I think that a lot of us are born into a certain set of social ideas as being acceptable. And I think that that's why people are, I think, my age and older are increasingly shocked by what millennials will advocate for. But for millennials, they're not actually going that far because they were already born into a system that recognized things like gay marriage as being completely okay. They grew up reading, Heather Has Two Mommies and books like this 10 and 20 years ago. So now claiming that, well, gender is a social construct, or kids can be transgender, or this, these sorts of things isn't actually that far of a mental leap for them, because what was already normalized for them. And so this has been this, ceding of territory gradually in steps that's been going on for, in earnest, 100 years. But, obviously with modern technology, it's been rapidly increasing in the past, 50 to 60 years, certainly since the 1960s and the revolutions of that time. There's been an even faster push of these progressive notions and ideals. I
would actually posit that goes even further back. And as I've been detoxifying my mind of all these things which I've been brainwashed, like so many people over the years, you come to realize, and it's very awakening once you come to realize that practically everything that you were taught socially, if you went through public school, if you were in the mainstream of American thought, just how false everything is. But it certainly goes back a long way. The seeds were planted hundreds of years ago. And I'm just now beginning to get into a book, a very good one, that I recommend to everybody. I have it right here, actually. It's called Apostate by Kevin Swanson. It's Apostate. It's subtitled The Men Who Destroyed the Christian West. And I'm just a few chapters in. But the thesis of this very insightful writer, Kevin Swanson, who's actually a preacher over in Colorado, his thesis is that a lot of the figures who were responsible in destroying Western civilization as a Christian civilization were some of the people who were taught in our schools to respect as the great minds of Western civilization. He names people like Thomas Aquinas, like John Locke. Pretty much everything that you're forced to read in a liberal arts education or in high school was instrumental in some way in it bringing about the de-Christianization of Western civilization. Again, I'm just a few chapters in, but just as a very startling example is Thomas Aquinas. A lot of people might be taken aback by that because of the respect that people of faith have for Thomas Aquinas. Whether you're Christian or whether you're a Protestant, a lot of people consider him one of the great minds of Christian thought. Nevertheless, Mr. Swanson brings up a very good point in his book, and it is that what Thomas Aquinas did, even though he was not an apostate in the sense that some of these other people were. Some of these other people in the book, you read what they did in their lives, their biographies, and it's absolutely appalling. And there's absolutely no doubt that a lot of them were in fact possessed by Satan himself. You read about Karl Marx, for instance, who let two of his children die from starvation. Two of his daughters later commit suicide. In the last days of his life, he went insane, as did Friedrich Nietzsche, who among his works wrote a book titled The Antichrist and called himself the Antichrist. And so a lot of these people were flat out demonic. Some of the rest were simply mistaken. Nevertheless, their mistakes did a lot of harm. Thomas Aquinas fits into that camp because what he did was that he, in his epistemology, separated or differentiated between sacred knowledge and earthly philosophical knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
The previous thinkers had simply considered all knowledge, all truth to be the domain of God.
Right.
I mean, that's what the scripture itself teaches us in Proverbs. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Thomas Aquinas divided them into two separate camps, saying that they could each have a domain, and that is what ultimately initiated the beginning of humanism, that human beings could use their own reason, their own experience, apart from revelation, to construct systems of morality, systems of justice, government. So that's pretty much where everything started to go downhill.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I think so much of what we've internalized, sadly, is false, and it involves a lot of detoxification. Like I said, even a lot of things, people talk about. I still hear a lot of conservatives, a lot of people that I interact with. I live in a red area politically, so a lot of conservatives. But so often you hear people use things like talking about concepts like equality, for example, or diversity, feminism to some degree. All of these things which are not biblical, and yet even you go to your church, and sometimes you'll even hear them being declared from the pulpit as though they were gospel truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I agree with what you said about Aquinas. I think one of the biggest, theological red pills that I ever swallowed was the fact that the Western thought hundreds of years ago had kind of separated out kind of secular intellectual knowledge and the knowledge of God, and then tried to use like secular intellectual knowledge to then therefore prove God. And it kind of ended up leading to so much atheism, because then people weren't experiencing God in his creation, in everything. And it was something that was kept a little bit more in Eastern traditions, in Christian Eastern Christian traditions, but the West really lost it, unfortunately, which I think then, as you said, it's kind of a slippery slope from there to everything, that it was kind of got us just enough off the path. Right. Once you're just a little off the path, then the further you go down, the more off the path you are. And it also, when you're talking about this, I think one of the other biggest red pills for me, theologically speaking, was the realization that when Christ said, narrow is the way to heaven and wide is the gate to destruction, how much that was literally true in so many different ways. So it meant that the small way, the little way, that's where the truth was. The truth is on that narrow path too, which means that most of what you're going to hear is on that wide path. That's the majority of stuff out there is on that wide path. Whether you're talking about people's individual salvation, or whether you're talking about what you encounter as far as truth, and what you're taught about history, and what you're taught about science, what you're taught about theology, all of it is going to be on that wide path. It's not going to be on that narrow path. And you have to really seek to find that narrow path, because most of what you're going to encounter is the wide path. And then also with people, and I think one of the things that was a big disservice done to West and Western Christendom was that we started to have this notion of, universal salvation, like, oh, well, that's a good person, therefore they should be saved. And then we started to look at that wide path as like, well, then all those people are going to heaven and they don't need to try. And there's no having to listen, there's no, you don't have to believe in Jesus, and you don't have to follow his rules, or we're all sinners anyways, what does it matter? And it kind of led into all of that. And one of the hardest things to accept, I think, also as a person, is that, again, narrow is the way to heaven. Most of the people that you meet in your everyday life aren't on the path to heaven. Now, God willing, they'll get on that path, but they're not. And that's something that's really hard to understand as a Westerner and to accept as a Westerner, because we're really taught. And again, I think it goes back to that egalitarian, like that equality of outcome, that very communist idea, not equality of opportunity, which of course Christianity is. Christianity gives an equality of opportunity to all men. All men might be saved through Christ, but you have to believe in Christ, to profess Christ, and you have to, put forth a good effort of it, and really believe it and follow through with it. But with the communist idea, with the Luciferian idea, is that, no matter what you do, we'll all, no matter how much effort you put in, or what kind of person you are, we should all have that equal outcome of getting to heaven. Yeah. We should all have that. We deserve that, for some reason. And that's really inverted the way that we should be looking at the world. The way we should be looking at the world is, I'm a sinner, we're all sinners, how do we get on the narrow path? Let's be looking for that little way, that little knowledge, that sacred knowledge, not all of this worldly stuff that's just easy and right here in front of us. Let's hunt for what's true and what's deep and what's meaningful and what gets us on that narrow path.
That's exactly right. And it circles back to what we said a little bit earlier about the walls around heaven and how much the left and all these people wish that they could tear down that wall. But one important thing I've come to realize is that none of this is accidental. And I think that is where we need to raise awareness for a lot of people of faith. I encounter that a lot in church. A lot of people, they just speak in these vague terms, saying, oh yeah, the world is becoming more wicked, and I guess there's nothing we can do about that. We just kind of have to put up with it, and if we get martyred, we get martyred. It's so passive about it. And I guess I understand their passivity, I suppose, because they just think that it is random, spontaneous, accidental. But once you really understand the scriptures and understand history, you realize it's anything but. Everything that's been happening has been very, very deliberate. You go back, for example, to communism. And there's something we talked a little bit about last time as well. The origins of communism. Karl Marx was not the true originator or idea of communism or the Communist Manifesto. Again, he was hired by the League of the Just, which was really part of the Illuminati. The Communist Manifesto was largely already written by a previous writer. I'm sorry, his name escapes me, but I'll send it to you and you can get out to your followers. It was already largely written, and they basically hired Marx to touch it up, add a few things here and there, get it ready for publication. When it came out, it didn't even have his name on it for decades and decades. Till later on, they decided that they would elevate Marx as a hero of their cause to build a mythos around him. Mm. So, the Illuminati, so much has been said about them. I will say this, it's fascinating, this realization I had. So often this movement, this Luciferian movement, this Luciferian conspiracy, I think it's the best way to term it, talks about enlightenment. You have the Illuminati, light, right? Light, illumination. You have the Enlightenment movement, which, if you read things like this book, Apostate, and really study it, you realize that the Enlightenment, even things that seem innocuous as John Locke, at the end of the day, all it was really all about was displacing Christianity as the dominant presence in Western civilization. So the Enlightenment, Illuminati, what's the connection there? It's always about light, that they're becoming enlightened, that they're somehow becoming more enlightened than what? Well, like you said, Satan always tries to deceive people. He tries to imitate. We know that Jesus Christ is the light of the world, but now he's telling man that their own reason, their own rationality is the light which illuminates them. But in reality, what he's getting them is to worship him. Who is Lucifer? the name itself, Lucifer, son of the morning, Luz, that means light itself. He wants people to believe that he's the enlightened one, and so he deceives mankind with humanism, which, once you become a red pill, you realize just how devilish of an ideology that is. Whereas in school you're taught, oh yeah, humanism is pro-human. How can humanism be evil? It's pro-humanity.
Right.
But that's what they do. They're always so talented with using language, right, to make things sound good.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Good evil and evil good, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of that sorcery, I think, that the Bible, again, getting back to that, warns us about, and when you look at descriptions of wizards and witchcraft and all of that, it's always about these chants, these incantations. It's all about the words, and that, they'll even, even in Harry Potter, a lot of the spells and things are in kind of like Latin sounding or using Latin-esque words. And it's, this idea that if we get back to this like ancient language, that we can then manipulate the world around us through language or whatever. But it's almost this deification of language, right, as being able to manipulate the elements themselves. And so they use words like humanism. So like, oh yeah, and all of these campaigns, love is love, pretending that, if you're a conservative and you don't believe in homosexual marriage, well, then you're against love, because it's just about love, and all of these little tricks. Pro-choice is another one. They don't call themselves pro-abortion. They don't call themselves pro-baby murder. They call themselves what? Pro-choice. Well, choice is a good thing, right? We're taught that that's a good thing. And I think that when we get into our minds so much about this, when we get too intellectual about it, the way Aquinas kind of, again, set us onto that like over intellectualism path, then we overlook our obvious experiences. And I think that that's one of the things that most people go through when they get red pilled on various subjects, and is that they'll say, oh my gosh, like I've always known, this is observationally true, right? Like I've always known this is true, but I was so in my head with all these talking points that I literally overlooked the world as it was in front of me. And I think that so many people have that experience when they understand that. And again, that's part of that intellectualism, and it's part of that wizardry of words, is getting you to deny what's literally in front of your face and what you're literally experiencing, every day.
That's right.
Yeah. And then, go ahead. Sorry.
And I would say that adding to that lexicon of things that have been through the wizardry of language demonized in order to keep people from the truth is the idea or the phrase conspiracy theory. Nowadays, whenever the phrase conspiracy comes up, people say, oh, you're a wacky conspiracy theorist wearing a tinfoil hat. It's just the thought of the word conspiracy automatically shuts off people's brains from thinking rationally, and they just automatically write you off. When in reality, the conspiracy theory of history has so much evidence in its favor. Going back a little bit to what we were talking about, the tie between the Illuminati, the historical Illuminati, and communism. Communism really was, in its essence, not in its essence, it was the Illuminati simply rebranded. And they weren't successful the first time around. The governments of Europe quickly caught on to them and acted very, very strongly in order to suppress them and to destroy them. So they said, okay, we'll simply reorganize. We'll rebrand ourselves. We'll create communism. And I mean, as you've seen, the Illuminati, they were involved in the French Revolution. As the Carbonari, they were in Italy. They were involved in the unification of Italy. So they've been all over the place. And sadly, here in the United States as well, we haven't escaped from the socialist, communist, Illuminati threat, whatever you want to call it. You could simply call it the Neo-Babylonian threat or conspiracy. at the end of the day, because that's what it is. Going back biblically, we know Satan is the author of all the conspiracies or combinations. Satan is the author of all these things. And the great purpose behind everything that he does, of course, is to thwart God's plans. What does God desire? That human beings should come to this earth in order to be born, have a body, gain experience, and obey his commandments so they can return and live in heaven with him, receive of salvation. So everything that Satan does is with the intention of destroying that plan of salvation. And so if you go back to Genesis, back when he began to deceive people, lead people astray, he led Cain astray in order to murder his brother Abel. He led many people astray back in the days before the flood. And because of the wickedness with which Satan deceived people and led them into sensuality, into sin and wickedness, the earth became so corrupt that God had to wipe everybody out. He tried to do the same thing at the Tower of Babel. He knew that by uniting everybody under despotic government would allow him to do two things. He would be able to influence everybody to act sinfully through the power of tyranny. He'd be able to suppress Christianity, again, through power statism. And so God said, no, you're not going to do that. I'm going to separate the nations so that no one person can be powerful enough to control everything and lead the entire world population into the same state of world corruption that required their complete destruction before the flood. Because he had already promised Noah that he wouldn't destroy the whole world by flood again. However, we know that a widespread destruction will occur prior to Christ's second coming. The wicked shall be burned to stubble. Only the righteous will be saved. And the mechanism by which Satan wants to achieve that level of world corruption and destruction is through this conspiracy, which involves creating a universal one world tyrannical totalitarian government, which will oppress Christianity, to outlaw it and make sure nobody worships it, and which at the same time promotes devilishness and sensuality, persuading people, indoctrinating them to accept sin as normal. And so little by little, he leads people to hell, and he ultimately prepares them for physical destruction as well. So that's what the master plan is and has been all along. That was the plan in the Illuminati, in communism, and it's the plan right now with all the globalism that we see, all of which is bound together. Once you start studying things, you see how communism itself, was only ever one part of the plan. And it's not over, by the way. I wrote the other day, actually, I was musing that did we really win the Cold War? Because America's a lot closer to becoming a socialist state today than it ever was at the height of the Soviet Union. But the forces that they were promoting and growing socialism were coming right out of here in the US. It was conspiracy based right out of Wall Street in New York. We talked last time about the Statue of Liberty and whether the Statue of Liberty is the Whore of Babylon described in Revelation chapter 17. And we were musing about that. And since that time, with more study and meditation and prayer, I've come to the absolute realization that it absolutely is a representation of that. Now, whether that was intentional on the part of the people responsible for building a Statue of Liberty or not, I don't know. But sometimes God allows things to happen so that they can become a sign or a clue for those who are spiritually aware, for the righteous, for the saints. Now, Statue of Liberty, right off the coast of New York. Why is that mystery Babylon, as described in Revelation, the figure with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, sitting upon many waters? Well, New York, and particularly Manhattan, New York City, I should say. It's the center of what? Center of the Federal Reserve,
Mm-hmm.
the United Nations, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, the Council on Foreign Relations, United Nations, I think I said already, all of these things and many more, all of these globalist and international banking organizations, all of which have the exact same goal of working toward world government. And not by accident. If you follow the history, you come to realize that it was the same people who laid the foundation for all of these things. It was the same people who were behind the United Nations, were the people who were behind the Federal Reserve. They're the people behind the income tax. And if you go back in history just a little bit, and it is so multi-layered that I know we don't have time for it, but just kind of a brief glimpse. It was J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan, who we know when he was in England, he was a protege of the Rothschilds. J.P. Morgan was behind several panics and bank runs. He did them intentionally in order to sell the idea of a central bank. Later on in the 20th century, Paul Warburg of the Warburg banking dynasty in England, and they were also, interestingly enough, associates of the Rothschilds. Paul Warburg and his brother Felix immigrated to the U.S., to New York, became partners in the biggest financial company in the country, Kuhn Loeb and Company. So Paul Warburg quickly established himself as an associate of Morgan and of Rockefeller. That group were the ones who were responsible for the Federal Reserve. Paul Warburg, associates of Rockefeller, including presidents of several of his banks, associates of J.P. Morgan, and the Rockefeller associate Edward Mandell House. These were some of the individuals who were present at Jekyll Island, Georgia, at a special meeting in the early 20th century, where they themselves admitted to later on to, at that meeting, having mapped out and prepared the legislation that eventually became the Federal Reserve Act. Edward Mandell House, who was there, and he was a very strong associate of Rockefeller. Edward Mandell House authored a book titled Philip Drew Administrator, published anonymously at first. Decades later, he admitted to having been its author. In that novel, it centers around a character who wants to obtain complete power over the United States. And he wants to create what he calls, quote, socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. And among the steps that he initiates to get to that goal are the creation of a central bank and the creation of a League of Nations. I mean, Karl Marx himself in the Communist Manifesto says that two of the planks to getting towards a socialist state are a central bank and a progressive income tax. And so, and you go back to the history, and one of the people I forgot to mention who helped to found the Federal Reserve was at Jekyll Island, Georgia, was Senator Nelson Aldrich, who again was a very close associate of the Rockefellers. Actually, Nelson Aldrich ended up marrying off his daughter to John D. Rockefeller Jr. That couple had a son whose name was Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. Nelson Rockefeller, very famous liberal Republican who was practically, if you read up later on, he was basically the handler of Richard Nixon, and a very influential man in American politics in his day, along with his brother David Rockefeller. Just a little bit more because I know so much, but these men helped to create the Federal Reserve. They entrusted it to Nelson Aldrich, a Republican, to sell it in Congress. But because he was so well known as a member of the banking elite being tied to the financial industry, the bill failed. So they said, okay, we're going to have to try to sell it, but sell it through the Democrats instead. That's how they found themselves a patsy by the name of Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson, a college professor, not very enthusiastic or charismatic, but the president of Princeton University. So they helped him get to the presidency. They helped him obtain the governorship of New Jersey in 1911. 1 year later, he becomes president of the United States. After being one, how to do that? Well, he had immense backing from Rockefeller and from from Rockefeller and from J.P. Morgan and others from Carnegie. They knew that he would never be able to beat William Howard Taft on his own. William Howard Taft had vetoed he'd been against the Federal Reserve Bill when it was originally proposed. So anyway, so they made a new bill, and they put it through the Democrats in Congress instead of the Republicans. And they made sure they passed it off to the American people as a way to control the banks, to put an end to the banks, the big bankers. The American people didn't realize it was the big bankers themselves who were behind the legislation. Well, ultimately, William Howard Taft was opposed, like I said, to the Federal Reserve or a central bank, which is why they found themselves Wilson to do it. But they couldn't beat him on his own. So that's where Theodore Roosevelt came in. And J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller and Company, they were heavy financiers of Theodore Roosevelt's independent run in order to split the Republican ticket and get Woodrow Wilson safely elected to the presidency. So what did he do once he was in there in office? Signed the Federal Reserve and helped to pass the graduate income tax. Mm-hmm. But what was the next step? Get the United States to sell its sovereignty. That's where the League of Nations would come in. I also have to mention that Edward Mandell House, who, as I mentioned, was a close part of the insiders and responsible at the meeting, actually, for making the Federal Reserve. He became a member of the Wilson administration, and he was Woodrow Wilson's controller. Woodrow Wilson actually said that Mr. House is my second personality. He is my independent self. His mind and my mind are one, he said.
Wow, that's really creepy.
Curiously, Edward Mandell House did not have an official title in the Wilson administration. Nevertheless, he was an advisor in the White House and his closest confidant. For example, when Leon Trotsky was detained in Canada, he was trying to get to Russia. He was detained by the Canadian Navy. So him and his ship and the men that he had and all the money he was carrying to get back to Russia to participate in the Bolshevik Revolution. Woodrow Wilson sent Edward Mandell House over to Canada to negotiate to get Leon Trotsky to be able to go free over to Russia to help out Lenin.
Right.
It was also Lenin, by the way, received lots of gold money backing from none other than Jacob Schiff of Kuhn-Loeb and Company, who had also helped, of course, to create the Federal Reserve, who is in league with the Warburgs. Paul Warburg, I'd mentioned earlier, became the first chairman of the Federal Reserve. Woodrow Wilson campaigned on a platform for re-election on keeping us out of the war. He ended up getting us into the war, World War I, almost as soon as he got re-elected. He used the Lusitania bombing. If everyone remembers, the Lusitania was a ship that was sunk by Germans. It had American passengers on board. Well, the Lusitania was sunk 2 years before we entered the war, and yet it was resurrected as a thing in order to incite people to want to get into the war. What often isn't discussed is that the Lusitania had millions of rounds of ammunition on it being carried, bought, by the way, by J.P. Morgan, being sold to the British. And the Germans had announced that they would sink any ship carrying ammunition, and they warned passengers, not to get on it. When the Lusitania was about to depart, there were even representatives of the German government right there telling people not to get on that ship, and passing out flyers so that they wouldn't get on.
Yeah.
But they sent them out intentionally with the purpose of having it sunk in order to bring the U.S. into war.
Mm-hmm.
And Woodrow Wilson suppressed schematics of the sunken ship that had the ammunition displayed. So he didn't want people to see that there had been ammunition being transported to the other side. And so what happened, America went to war.
Mm-hmm.
And the war that probably would have ended as a stalemate with a negotiated treaty ended up with a very badly beaten Germany, ultimately resulting in the creation of the League of Nations. Because the League of Nations, they said, the only way we can guarantee peace forever is to establish this league in which all the countries of the world will be able to work out their differences. Only problem, and Edward Mandell House, Warburg, and others, the establishment, were present as representatives of the U.S. government at the League of Nations organization. But the problem was that they couldn't sell it to the American people. The American people voted against it in our Congress. So what happened? They said, well, it didn't work this time, but if we have one more war, we'll be able to persuade them. And that's where eventually they got World War II. And if you look into it, we don't have time for tonight, I know, but you'll find out that FDR knew all about Pearl Harbor, that Pearl Harbor was going to be bombed. He let it happen because they want us in World War II. And they want us in World War II. Why? Because the League of Nations had failed. But afterward, what did everybody say? We've had 2 world wars. They were so disastrous. We've got to get this league in. So let's create the United Nations and get the U.S. in there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So much.
And I guess I'll just say one last thing, though.
Yeah.
If this is kind of a piece of the puzzle, one of the key pieces is that after the effort to get the United States into the League of Nations failed, that's when Rockefeller, Morgan and Company, through Edward Mandell House, founded one of the most important organizations in the world today everyone should be aware of, the Council on Foreign Relations. Edward Mandell House was the first leader of the Council on Foreign Relations, a private organization, for those of you who don't know, based in New York City. It is a by invitation only group that includes members of the banking elite in the United States, other members of the corporate elite, heads of all the major media corporations, major people in government, people who have been president, people who have been secretaries of state, secretary of defense, people who have been involved in all levels of the federal government, often in state and defense departments. What goes on in there is typically not published. But if you read, and they say that they have no political philosophy, and yet if you read their magazine called Foreign Affairs, then you find that practically everything that they advocate is with the intention of creating world government. And it's not even a supposition. They themselves have said it in their articles that they are trying to create world government.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'm going to pause there for a sec and read a couple of super chats, and then I'm going to respond. I've been taking actually a couple of notes out of a couple of things to say, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up. But Archeon or Arceon, I forget how to say that, $2 super chat, thank you, says, the most satanic movie ever is Mother, and I've not seen that movie, but also $5 from Arceon says the Vatican has been corrupted by communists. It started with Vatican II. And yeah, I think Vatican II in the Catholic Church in I think it was the 50s or 60s, I can't remember the exact date, is very on par with what happened to a lot of Christianity at that time period. It wasn't just the Catholics that kind of had this revolution come in. Arceon, another $5. I believe that the Holy Father and all his saints would not want the state to have anything to do with the marriage, with the marriage in the first place. Give unto God. That was actually, and it's funny that that's brought up back when I used to be more liberal or libertarian. I didn't think maybe that there was anything necessarily wrong with gay marriage in and of itself. The first reason that I opposed it was looking at that and saying, well, okay, well, if I believe in marriage, and this is when I was a new Christian, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm a Christian and I believe in marriage is a province of God, then what is the state doing in it anyways? You know, I mean, take out, like, even you can even take out the moral aspect of gay marriage, but like the state shouldn't be involved in marriage at all. And then I ended up researching that and how the government, or the US government anyways, became part of issuing licenses to people, and again, it goes back to control, because you used to just go and get married with your minister, your pastor, your priest, whatever it was, and you wrote it down in your family Bible. You know, John married Mary on, you know, this day, and that was all the proof you needed. You know, you could take that to any court in the land and they would uphold the marriage in any way that you needed. But then the government decided to get involved and start issuing its own certificates and things in order to control who could get married to whom and when. Yeah. And that's very interesting too. Dale Jones, $5, no comment. Thank you very much. But yeah, in response to some of the things that you said, just really quick, when you're talking about conspiracy theory and that how like that's the new buzzword, it shuts or buzz phrase, it just shuts people down. You say, and I think of Alex Jones, obviously, and what he's been through recently, like massive deplatforming, really just trying to shut him up. And the first thing you always read in all the media is conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, conspiracy theorist to conspiracy. Yeah. And that's supposed to like make you think, oh, this guy's a wacko, he's a nut job. And it's really gone from back when I was younger, conspiracy theory just meant somebody who was kind of into alternative things. They might be a prepper, they might be in kind of like those avenues, but they weren't necessarily nuts or anything like that. But it's really, really been amped up just within the last few years to really unperson somebody, to really make them crazy. And then I think, or to make them crazy in the mind of the popular in the popular mind. And I think what's interesting about that too is because it's also happening at a time when so many of these conspiracy theories are being proven true, especially with the election of Trump. And one of the things I used to say when Trump was running for office and these things were like coming out, especially with the spirit cooking and all of these things, I actually said to my husband at one point, like, I don't want to live in a world where Alex Jones is right, you know, because Alex Jones have been saying this for years and years, like they're getting together and they're worshiping Satan and they're like eating blood and they're, you know, whatever. And I always thought, oh, he, you know, I think he's a little out there. I don't know that everything, you know, I don't think everything he says is true. And then it was crazy because during the election in particular, all these things were coming out with the emails and the WikiLeaks and the spirit kicking stuff. And it was like, oh my gosh, these people literally are doing the things that Alex Jones said they were doing. And so then they really pumped up that conspiracy theory phrase. And then, you know, and that gets over to like media and money. And I think when you were talking, giving like your historical overview, what was standing out in my mind was you take the money and you take the media and they spin whatever story they want. And they just basically do whatever they want. And of course, I've been through that personally where, you know, they make up lies about me, whatever, put it in the press. And like, there's almost the degree to which the media controls what we think is really frightening. Like, I didn't even realize that. And I've been kind of anti-media most of my adult life, pretty much. But like the extent to which they spin these narratives is absurd. Like you don't know until you're inside of it yourself, like what I've been through personally. And you're like, oh my gosh, they completely, I used to think that maybe they exaggerated and lied from time to time, but they just completely lie. And that's where you see the rise of people like Ocasio-Cortez. I have nothing against her personally. I think she's probably probably a well-intentioned person who's just maybe naive and misguided. I don't know. Maybe she's evil, but I don't think she's evil in and of herself. But the rise of her, you can see that they've like literally picked her out. They've plucked her out. They're like, she's charismatic. She's well-spoken. She's, you know, good looking. She's fun. She makes these fun videos. And we can use her. And so they've just, and you know, like I'm sitting there thinking like the type of person she is and the values she is and the age that she is, like there's skeletons in that girl's closet. You know that girl's got some skeletons. You know, she's got like some three-ways or some drunken this or like she's got stuff out there that would make her look bad. Like most of us do. but you don't hear a whisper of it. You don't hear a whisper because they've picked her, they've chosen her. So no one is ever, I mean, if anybody ever was to say anything negative about her and come out and say, well, I knew her in high school and she was, doing this or that, or something tawdry or illicit or something that would damage her reputation, they probably off that person. Like literally, with the media and the money together like that, and the way that they just pick out these people, and then they just pick out other people again to like completely demonize, and they've done it throughout history. Like you can go and look at all these world leaders, people you've been told to hate. Oh, this is the epitome of evil, or this is the epitome of good. And like you go and you research it, and there's not really usually much difference between the people you've been told were evil and the people that you were told were good. I mean, it's like really frightening, but you see how that they've just been doing this whole time. And then another thing that you were saying that stood out to me was when you were talking about like nations almost as being these sacred sections was the word that came to my mind. But it's like, if you have these people that are united together in purpose, and they understand what they're fighting for, and they understand their family and their culture and their nation, and they have pride in it, and they're harder to control, and they're harder to talk into these manipulative strategies that the banking and everything has done. But I was thinking about even in our personal lives, a lot of criticism in Christianity and different sects of Christianity is that certain people can't hold certain positions. And what I was thinking, if I can articulate this in a way that makes sense, is that, like, we'll take the priesthood, for example, because that's in a variety of religions. So Catholics, Mormons, they don't allow women to hold priesthood roles. They only allow men. And so they're heavily criticized for that. But what's interesting is just like with the nations, if you band them all together and you make them all this one homogenous equal thing, then they're easier to control. You can get one tyrant over all these nations. Well, it's the same with roles within the family and within the church structure. If you were just to make it all equal, like all people can do all things at all time, anyone can have the priesthood, for example, and there's no sacred sectioning out of like different peoples doing different things, then again, you can have the same thing, because you can have one person dominate all of these now equalized people who are all performing the same role like robots, right? There's no separating them out where they're like, okay, this is my function within a wider contextual community where I'm interacting with people. Once everybody's doing the same thing, then there's nothing sacred anymore. Once everyone has the priesthood, then nobody has the priesthood, right? And so that's what they're doing on the national level, but that's what they're doing theologically, and then also what they do in families, and with gender, that's the same, there's, mom and dad are interchangeable, that's how they started. Well, mom can go to work and dad can stay home. Well, now, now we've gone so far as like, there is no gender. And of course, the next thing they're pushing with the transgender children, and with what we've seen recently with transgender children dancing in strip clubs and stuff, is they're pushing like there's no consent, of age for sex. And there's no, we're just all these, interchangeable units. There are no children, there are no parents, there are no men, there are no women. And then once there is no sacred role that you have within your family, your community, your faith, then we're just all these robots that can all be guided, right, by one control. I don't know. That's what came to my mind. And then how New York, of course, you were talking about banking in New York and the Statue of Liberty being the Whore of Babylon. And of course, New York financed the Russian Revolution. The Communist Revolution in Russia was completely financed basically by the bankers in New York, all of these same people that you were just talking about. And not only because Russia at the time materially was the wealthiest country, was also one of the last really strong Christian religious holdouts as far as like the monarchy. And people, you can criticize the monarchy, maybe they didn't do this right or they didn't do that right, but they were legitimately very strong Christians, and the nation was a very strongly Christian nation. And that was one of the things that they really wanted to be able to break up, because they were very unified, very nationalistic, and very Christian in their faith, particularly being Orthodox, because then they had their own, they were like their own thing. They were like Russian Orthodox. And so it was a unification of their nationalism and their Christian theology. Yeah. And they really needed to, they really needed to get rid of that, these global power schemers, because that just was really going to stand in their way.
Right. Well, there's a couple important lessons from the book of Revelation that tie into these things. In Revelation 13, it talks about the beast that rises out of the sea. And the beast that comes out of the sea, I've come to realize, is that conspiracy. It's the same as the Tower of Babylon. It says they worship the dragon, which gave power unto the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, "Who is like unto the beast?" So you see this conspiracy. It's pushing globalism and pushing socialism on the world. And what it does is that first it develops a form of statism, getting man to worship the state, but simultaneously it's getting man to worship Satan, just like here. They worship the dragon and they worship the beast. And later on in this chapter, it talks about a second beast, known later on in the book of Revelation as the false prophet. The beast, it says, it caused the people of the inhabitants of the earth to worship the first beast. It says it performed wonders and miracles to deceive the people. It says that it created an image of the beast, and it made the image of the beast to speak. And then later on it says that this false prophet, this second beast, made it such that people had to have the mark of the beast on their hand or on their forehead in order to buy and to sell. So what is this? What is a false prophet? Well, in my judgment, the false prophet, the second beast, is the media in general. It encompasses Hollywood, it encompasses the news media, it encompasses Silicon Valley in general, but especially social media. Because you see, Hollywood, for example, has the masses hypnotized. People believe everything they see on the TV. If they see a movie or a TV show telling them that they need to believe this, that God is outdated, that Christianity is false and oppressive, that they believe it. The things they see on a television screen, on a movie screen, are more real to people than even the things they behold with their own with their own eyes in real life. You have the news media deceiving people. You have all the technological wonders of Silicon Valley dazzling people, performing modern day miracles, and people are so drawn to these things. They put greater emphasis on these things than on God himself, and then they're so easily led astray. Social media, people are so dazzled by the social media. A celebrity comes on Twitter and says, "You need to support transsexuals," turning small children into transgenders is a beautiful thing, and suddenly everybody believes it. And not only that, but we've seen already so much how these startup companies based out of Silicon Valley are not only suppressing the word of God on their platforms, but again, even making it such that people cannot buy and sell if they stick to traditional values. Not only social media platforms, but other tech startups out of Silicon Valley, Stripe, PayPal, and others, Indiegogo, banning people, preventing them from making a living if they do not toe the line with the social justice warrior narrative. In other words, if they don't carry the mark of the beast.
Yeah, 100%. I completely agree. And I think that obviously that's why traditionalism and Christianity are targeted, because if you are a Christian and you're a traditionalist and particularly if you have a family, you're going to have the theological background, the spiritual background, and the everyday life wisdom and experience to see through most, if not all, of these tricks that they try to play on people. For me, in my personal experience, I know so many people have been through this. I was just typical person raised in the liberal public school system, swallowed everything I was fed like a good little girl, because, you want to get those A's, and that's how you achieve, and you want to get those degrees and this and that. And, I was really good at that. I was really good at wanting to play the part and get the accolades for that. And get the praise for that. And, it wasn't until I started doing something real with my life when I, got married, started having children. And it started out with something so simple for me, in that I wanted to have a home birth, and I wanted to breastfeed, and I wanted to do what's called attachment parenting, which is kind of some more traditional form of parenting. And that was really the first domino that fell for me in a lot of ways, because once I was like really hooked into that natural godly way of being, like that, the way that God kind of wanted set our lives out to be, then all of a sudden everything made sense. Then all of a sudden, I'm like, oh yeah, God coming down as Christ incarnate and coming to the earth as a child first, born of the Virgin Mary, like all of that made sense, like once I became a mother. And before, it never had, it never clicked. I was like, what, and I totally believed all the anti-Christian propaganda I was taught, like, oh, well, why would God become a baby why would he not be a king? Christianity makes no sense. Blah, 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 all this stuff. But then once I lived just that little bit of a real life, and I was like hungry for more, it was like, oh, okay, now this makes sense. What else makes sense? And the more you do it, the more it makes sense. And so they have to get rid of that. They have to get rid of Christianity and traditional family. And that's why they hit that so hard. Like, some people are always amazed at like how, I was banned from Patreon and Twitter twice. And, even small things like Teespring, Pinterest, like all the Facebook multiple times, like, one time Facebook banned me, I think it was like a 30-day or 1 week. I can't remember how long the ban was, just for a picture of my face. Like, that was it. It was just like my profile picture. And people are like, that's crazy. Like, you don't cuss, you don't do anything. And they don't understand that traditional Christianity and family is more frightening to this evil, this conspiracy of evil, this neo-Babelism that we've been talking about, this Luciferianism, than any person who's coming up and factually, giving their 10 points about the wall. This is why we need the wall. Here are the facts. Facts are great, but if you're a mom and you're a dad and you have kids, you know why you need the wall. Like, no one needs to explain it to you in facts. It's your experiential reality that you don't leave your door unlocked. Our nation should not leave its door unlocked. Boom, it makes sense. Like, you don't even have to get to that level of intellectually convincing people, because it's their lived experience and they know it from their gut. Right. So they have to stop that.
Absolutely. And, I think that Neo-Babylonian conspiracy is a perfect way to describe it. There are lots of names. In the scriptures, it's referred to lots of different ways. The beast, the Tower of Babylon, the Great and Abominable Church. But getting back to the Tower of Babel, it really describes the nature or the operation of the conspiracy itself, which is to create world government and the use of political power in order to eradicate people's freedom to worship Christ and ultimately destroy his plan. And really, all these things testify at the end of the day to the truthfulness of the gospel of Jesus Christ, because when you see, there's no other explanation for how radically they fight against it. All these different things, we know that globalism, communism, etc., they're all tied together. Most in the world don't realize it. They just see these independent entities, and yet coincidentally, all these independent entities always have one thing in common, and that is the eradication of Christianity. They might even support different kinds of religions. They'll support witchcraft, paganism, Islam, mysticism. And yet, interestingly, Christianity is always taboo for them. Why? Because it is the true faith. Jesus Christ is the Savior of the world, and these people are his enemies and the servants of the great enemy, Satan. But the most important thing is that we can continue to pray and to hold fast to the commandments personally, strengthen our families by being leaders in our homes, by teaching the word to our children, by attending our church services and being good neighbors to those people around us. That we can continue to read the scriptures, because that's where so many of these things are found. And a lot of them, it's funny because a lot of people may read the scriptures, but maybe they read them superficially and then realize just how much of what we're seeing in the world today is right here in the Bible, as we've seen in this conversation we've had this evening. And once you internalize these things and pray to God for the Spirit and have your mind illuminated by the Holy Ghost, then you're able to see the signs that God is putting in front of you that are really out in the open, but you never realized it. Things like the Statue of Liberty, for example. Something even like the dollar bill, which just realized the other day. You have on the Great Seal, I'm sure a lot of you have seen the Great Seal, the Eye of Providence, New Order for the Ages. In Latin, also translated as New World Order, the phrase so often used by the globalists. And then the pyramid, uncompleted pyramid. Well, in the ancient world, at the Tower of Babel, they didn't have towers like they're so often depicted in artwork. What they have? They had pyramids. Right. The Tower of Babel was a pyramid.
Yeah.
The pyramid on the Great Seal is uncompleted because God paused the destruction when he scattered the people. So the Tower of Babel is right there. A clear warning right there that God put right in front of us, that we can understand the nature of the conspiracy. He put right there on a Federal Reserve note, right on a piece of paper printed by one of the chief instruments of the conspiracy. So pray to God, he'll illuminate you and keep your eyes open, and you won't have to be afraid.
Definitely. I think that's a wonderful note to end it on, for sure. Keep praying. God is everywhere and he's in all things, and he can definitely get to you if you are listening. So you're never somewhere that he can't speak to you. Thank you. I want to thank you, Luis, so much for coming on tonight. This has been an amazing conversation. I've been checking out the chat while you were speaking. A lot of support for what you were saying. A lot of people were very encouraged to hear so much truth spoken so articulately and so boldly. So I think this was a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad you're able to come on my show tonight, and definitely going to have you back as often I think as I can get you on, because I think that you have so much wisdom to share with us. Is any last words before we go ahead and wrap it up?
No, none. Just thank you for having me on, and thank you everybody for putting up with me. Those of you who sat through the 90+ minutes, congratulations to you. You had a lot of patience listening to me for that long. But thank you everybody.
Yes, thank you everybody for tuning in. And remember, if you like what I do, you can always support me over at wifewithapurpose.com/support. You can go to paypal.me/wifewithapurpose. You can also go to my Etsy shop. That's a really wholesome way to support me if you don't want to go through the PayPal and all of that and let them take their cut. But etsy.com/wifewithapurpose. I've got a shop, etsy.com/shop/wifewithapurpose. The link is below in the description box if you need it. And that will take you to all of my artwork, and I've got embroidery, cross-stitching on there now, and lots of vintage goods. So if you want to support my work that way, it's a win-win, because you get to buy yourself or somebody else a gift at the same time. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.